Welcome to Bring It Home. I'm Craig Fuller here with John Paul Hampstead. JP, how are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Welcome to Bring It Home. This is the show that we talk about the America reindustrialization revolution. It is taking place. There's so much exciting things happening. Donald Trump's landslide victory is certainly going to drive more reindustrialization. This fact was already taking place across our economy as manufacturing was coming back. It's just going to go insane with the level and speed of what Donald Trump is doing in terms of policy and really trying to focus on America reindustrialization. Lots of exciting things that are happening around that story.
Some people were surprised by the magnitude of the victory. Since that night, of course, he's made a number of announcements to his cabinet, to sort of other political appointee positions and policies that he wants to bring about. But I think the business community is sort of really excited about the results. You saw that from the stock market, popping on November 7th, the day after. That's continued. What are you hearing among the business leaders
Well, I think everyone's super bullish, but I think the more important story is about this reindustrialization element. And the idea is that I think because of the fact that it was such a substantial win, particularly around popular vote, more so than even the Electoral College, is it means that a lot of the policies are going to come fast and furious. And I think if you are running a supply chain and you're thinking about, hey, I have more time to sort of sort this out, you're kind of put on notice now for reindustrialization. There's so much exciting things happening around the idea of reindustrialization. Policy is certainly going to drive that. One of the things I think, that you have to keep in mind is that companies, the way our economy works is really on a quarter-by-quarter basis. Yep. This is how companies sort of think. And so while the cost of producing in China and other parts of the world, that discount, the delta, the savings you would have normally gotten from China to the U.S., the arbitrages, it's actually narrowed over the last decade, particularly when we compare places like Mexico and China. But it's narrowed, and because the cost of producing products in China is now much more expensive than it was 10 years ago, largely due to a demographic issue, companies didn't have an incentive to look at it. They weren't incented to think about, okay, I need to think about moving my sourcing. It did happen in certain industries, and certain companies did that. But really, the catalyst is the fact that these tariffs will be put into effect, and companies have to think beyond a quarter. Now they have a little bit of an excuse. So CEOs and CFOs that would have chosen to move manufacturing out of China probably wouldn't have been apt to do it because they're worried about missing a quarter or two. Now they have the backdrop of tariffs as a threat to say, I need to go make those investments. And to them, it gives them a little bit of cover. I think that's a fantastic thing.
And then you've got, the Fed is continuing to lower rates. You've got the prospect of lower corporate taxes in the U.S., or the extension, at least, of the Donald Trump, the first administration's tax cuts. There are a couple of different factors in play that should allow corporations to make investments, whether it's like a strategic move or, opening something up here or sourcing, to give them a little bit of cushion to take that kind of risk.
And it's also there's so much talked about tariffs and the cost of tariffs. And there's been some recent publications and research out there that, currency offsets could manifest itself to actually mitigate a lot of the cost of tariffs that potentially could impact corporate bottom lines. Is that China may devalue its currency. In the process of doing it, you have some offsetting principles that happen economically. I think that's a really interesting part of the story that isn't being played out, where on an academic basis, it's easy to say, hey, this is effectively a tax on consumers. But when you look at what we saw back in 2018, 2019 is we didn't see high inflation. We didn't see the cost get passed on to consumers. Yet we still have we had a 25% tariff put in place on Chinese goods, and it was a non-event, at least in that period of time. And even the industrial sector didn't slow down. Where there was a sort of a concern about the industrial, there was a very small, very light slowdown in the economy and portions of it as we sort of absorbed some of the changes where there was a sort of a pre-stocking of inventory and then a slowdown after. The economy was able to absorb those.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. And Hudson Bay Capital actually just released a paper about the sort of kind of rethinking our kind of dogmatic way that we approach tariffs. Kind of alluding to what you're talking about with the way that they don't necessarily produce price increases. They don't, because of the fact that you have these foreign currency exchanges sort of in between.
Or sort of an offsetting fact, and right? That's the great thing about currencies. It sort of keeps things
right,
sort of a balancing act.
So yeah, we've got some headlines we can talk about.
Before we do that, I think one of the things that I think is important is this national security story, and it's part of the American reindustrialization. Is that national security is also it has to be front and foremost as we think about it. And I think the cost of tariffs are one thing, and sort of like there's a lot of conversation, academic conversation, but it doesn't actually put any of the national security consideration as front and center, and it should be, particularly in industries that are most vulnerable to a potential geopolitical conflict.
And I think policymakers over the past few decades, have sort of dealt with like this unipolar world led by America as their kind of like base assumption, and then allowed corporations to kind of optimize for cost with that assumption that all of these trade lanes will be protected, that these countries will be like good partners, that freight will flow smoothly, things like that. But I think it becomes the supply chain looks very different if instead of optimizing for cost in a unipolar world, you're optimizing for like resilience or national security in a multipolar world.
And the issue that we've got, to your point, is that there's been a substantial cost to protect those trade lanes. Our military budgets is almost $1 trillion.
And the Red Sea is still not open.
No, that's right. The Red Sea is not open except for one container line who has the French Navy is escorting them, CGM. And I think what's really important about the story is that it's not CGM, it's Metro. Who is the
CMA CGM is this French?
They're the ones that are being escorted, right? The French Navy, yeah. So, but I think one of the things that's important is that national security should be a priority for the United States, and unless we want to continue to play the world's policeman, you can't have global trade that was never free anyways. It was never fair. No. China's ripped off our state industries and ripped off our industries and turned them into state industries, and they've ripped off our trade secrets and done so many different things. So let's just be frank, it wasn't ever truly free. And the other thing is, without having the U.S. Navy to protect those trade lanes, which they've proven, as you point out, in the Red Sea, that really with a small military group. I mean, this is a this is a group of like bandits.
Yeah.
I mean, they're compared to a country, they don't have a military. They're just a bunch of bandit terrorists that are out there attacking our ships, but have been able to disrupt civilian cargo. Imagine a national actor of the scale and sophistication of North Korea as an example, or even like imagine a military conflict with China, what that would mean for trade. And so without the United States really protecting those trade lanes, you almost have to consider this as a national security priority before a cost priority. And everyone gets caught up in the cost side of it, which is, there's a lot of reasons to sort of dispute that. But I think the one thing you can't dispute is the national security element, which is so important and so critical for our success as a country.
For sure. The rules of the game have changed, right? We're no longer in this sort of universal Pax Americana that we've imposed on the world. And therefore, all of these, everyone has to play by the rules. Like we're now in a world where we actually don't have the power to control every sea lane unilaterally. we have partners that are turning into adversaries, and we can't. It has to be part of like these boardrooms, sort of calculus and like strategic planning to understand that like no, we can't like just optimizing for cost and pretending like it's the 1990s could be.
It's very. I mean, China was not even though politically it might have been desired to be an adversary, or at least desired to be a regional power. It just didn't have the resources to do that. Yeah. Now it has the resources. Now it has an incredibly strong navy. It is focused on to becoming the Asian hegemon, and it wants to challenge American power in Asia, and at least Asia short term, and perhaps throughout the world long term. And you have to calculate that into your decisioning. And so I think the calculus now is this is a national security issue, not just a cost issue. Yeah. But there's some really exciting things happening. You mentioned headlines. Let's go ahead and get into the headlines.
So our first headline, the Biden-Harris administration is announcing an additional $1.5 billion of investment into passenger rail. This follows up a couple dozen billion that have been announced in 2023. This new grant is going into about 19 projects in the Northeast corridor. So kind of from, if you imagine like from Harrisburg going through Philly up into New York is like, that's the most traveled passenger rail corridor in the country. And a lot of these lines are really old. They have these, and I'm talking about this because this is at issue. There's 19 different projects on this. One of the biggest ones is about a $400 million project to replace the power systems sort of west of Philadelphia. And if you think about what these Amtraks look like, they have those cables that go over the cars. These were originally built in 1910. And so they need new like substations. It's a lot of like heavy industrial work, electrical substations. They expect these projects to generate about several thousand jobs in construction, over the next few years. But anyway, that's
go trains. I'm a big fan of the trains. So
big fan of trains. Amtrak is cool. I like investments in infrastructure.
Yeah, it's good. It's good for everything.
The freight railroads, of course, are maintained and built by private enterprise, but it's always cool to see it.
Passenger rail. I think in a corridor like that where you have high density, it makes sense. I think you see a lot of these train people on Twitter or X who talk about like, oh, if we only had trains everywhere. And like what they don't ever talk about is the cost to do that on a country as broad and as big as the United States. And they're sort of comparing Europe. But the geography of Europe, even in city geography and urban geography, is quite different than the United States. Look, I'm all for rail, but I'm also all for practical applications that make sense. And the nice thing about the Northeast is you have density, and that is Amtrak's profitable. They actually have routes that are profitable in the Northeast. Less so when you get outside of that corridor.
Yeah. I think there's a reason why like the commercial aviation industry took off in the U.S., right? Instead of high-speed rail.
Because you have these, effectively the United States is two islands. You have the West Coast. You have these mountains that are in between, which you could compare to oceans. You have the Great Plains. And then you have the East Coast. I mean, you really, when you get I-35 east and west, you don't really hit huge population centers until you get past the Sierra Nevadas. I mean, that's where California, you have density. I mean, you have some cities, but they're pretty sparse and pretty far out. I mean, Denver, the next nearest city would either be Phoenix or Salt Lake City. I mean, it's like these are not densely populated. I mean, if you go along the East Coast, it's Boston, it's New York, it's Baltimore, it's Philadelphia. All of that is in high dense area. If you go through Texas, it's the same thing. So density matters when we're talking about rail, and that's one of the advantages in the Northeast.
Second story, really interesting. This is actually from Computer World magazine. They published this
back to the 90s, man.
Yeah, I know. They published this.
By the way, I'm glad you're quoting a magazine. It just makes me happy.
It's a cool magazine. I used to read it as a kid, and I'm reading it.
And it used to be like thick. Do you remember in the .com days, like the thing was like that thick? Good for old magazines.
They published a news analysis piece saying that Apple's iPhone partners are making plans for U.S. manufacturing, and a lot of this sort of was prompted by the recent Foxconn earnings call, where the CEO Young Liu was like kind of like forced to, by the analysts to like acknowledge, like, they're kind of like, well, Trump just got elected. Like, what does that mean for Foxconn? And he quoted, he said, look, we have production in Texas and Wisconsin and Ohio, and we're ready for like additional aggressive expansion into the U.S. Like, should that make sense for our business? And so Computer World said it wasn't just Foxconn, it was also Pegatron and Quanta Computer, all of the different sort of suppliers into Apple. That was the kind of the unifying theme of
this is amazing, by the way. Like, computers, it's funny you mentioned Computer World, sort of takes me back on a nostalgic route. But remember, and you're younger than I am. And
I'm 40. So.
Yeah, but you're still of the same generation. I mean, you're in the same. But remember the big manufacturers back in the 80s and 90s were the big computer manufacturers. Packard Bell, Tandy. If you liked Radio Shack, Compaq was huge. HP was huge.
Dell was like the up and comer.
Dell ran an amazing supply chain out of Austin, Texas, and then actually opened a production plant in Nashville that is no longer in business. But Gateway Computer, the big old cowl things. Yes. I like building these computers in South Dakota. Like computers, traditional PCs, are the original like OGs of electronics manufacturing, or at least sort of modern my generation. The OGs when I was a kid of coming of age. And Computer World, thank you for bringing that one back.
PC World. So it's interesting that we used to have these like big boxy computers being made,
these cow boxes,
and shipped all over.
I now had this like nostalgic memory of the cow box going in the Gateway. Yeah. Gateway, before the Apple stores, Gateway had these stores you would go in and you would like buy your computer and it'd be shipped to your home. It was like the showroom, and they would have a cow. So it was really cool.
But it's cool that it's coming back in the form of like smartphones in the most advanced, like tiny.
That's an exciting story. Like I think we've forgotten about electronic manufacturing in the U.S. Consumer electronics manufacturing.
It's a huge market.
It is a huge market, and it's a big place that the United States used to be the leader in electronics manufacturing. We lost the transistor radio or the radio manufacturing to Japan. Then they started to sort of peel away a lot of our industries like TVs and other electronics. Computer manufacturing was sort of one of the later sort of holdouts.
Because the personal computer, I think, like kind of got going here.
It did. And the internet was sort of born in the United States, and a lot of software applications, it was just easier for them to manage it here. And so just a different kind of world where the U.S. has continued to lead that. So unfortunately, over the last 20 years, we've lost a lot of the computer manufacturing and electronics manufacturing to places like China and Japan and Korea and all this. And so it's cool to see it coming back. Hopefully, we'll get our cow boxes.
Yeah, and it's cool that the CEOs are sort of, they're aware of what's going on.
They're committed.
They're ready.
This isn't just
they've got plans.
This isn't just people like us talking about it. We're seeing movement.
And Wall Street is like putting pressure on them to like have answers for like, hey.
That's the important piece, is that CEOs have to have answers, and they get a little bit of cover, if you will, of saying we're going to invest X number of dollars, where they now have to justify not doing it, which I think will prompt them to do it. If they don't do it, they're going to be questioned why. If they do it, then I think the analysts and Wall Street will give them some air cover. But I think that's important.
Yeah, that's interesting, that sort of change of sentiment. Our last headline today, AstraZeneca adding $2 billion of investment for research and production in the U.S., generating 1,000 jobs by the end of 2026. So this is a next-gen biologics plant in Maryland, a cell therapy sort of expansion to existing facilities on the East Coast and the West Coast, and then a build-out of specialty manufacturing in Texas. We've talked a lot about pharmaceutical. Companies, investing heavily in the U.S. It's pretty interesting. It's something that, kind of before doing this show, I hadn't really thought of it being like
a big industry.
I mean, I knew that the pharma industry in the U.S. was obviously huge. I kind of associated it with like the biotech scene in Boston. I didn't really think about
San Diego. San Diego's a big biotech scene.
I didn't think about it on like the industrial scale that it takes to actually make everyone's medication.
Yeah, for sure. And I think sourcing the ingredients is always sort of part of the supply chain issue, is how do I get the ingredients to make these medications, but also the machinery, the equipment. China has really, taken a lot of our medicine manufacturing. We learned this during COVID, is just how vulnerable we were to China and India.
Right, and the various precursor compounds that are sort of like the basic ingredients to making the medicines. It's similar to other manufacturing processes where there are like sort of tiers of suppliers as you get back closer to raw materials.
Yeah, Puerto Rico used to be a leader in medicine manufacturing. They were just there was some tax incentives to build pharmaceutical manufacturing. I suspect that some of that still exists there, at least operationally, but China has certainly taken on an enormous amount of our medicine manufacturing. So I think it's interesting because these trends and I'm excited to talk to Brian, our guest today, who consults with companies about their manufacturing, automation, and robotics as they bring back manufacturing or just expand manufacturing. One of the things that I think is important is thinking about which industries specifically make sense. I talked to someone this week who's very close to big site selection processes, and they said the two areas that they're seeing a lot of interest is in automotive expansion, even in light of the EV questions with the Trump administration, but certainly automotive expansion, and the other is defense. Obviously, defense is getting a lot more attention recently with weapons.
I saw something that the U.S. has tripled its production of 155 millimeter shells since the beginning of the Ukraine war. I remember when that kicked off, people were concerned that we only have the capacity to make this number of shells. We've already sent them all to Ukraine. Like, what are we?
Never underestimate the defense industry.
It's like tripled. It's like tripled already, and it's probably going to triple again.
That's whether you love it or hate it. I remember the movie Lord of War with Nicolas Cage, and talks about just the fact that there will never be a shortage of war, and there will never be a shortage of people selling weapons of war. That sort of reminds me of that. It's an unfortunate reality, but defense is moving, automotive is moving. You've talked a lot about pharmaceutical moving. Let's bring Brian and talk to Brian about what he is actually seeing on the ground. I'm excited to have that conversation. JP, our guest today is an expert at reshoring and automation that's taking place across our manufacturing and warehouse supply chain. Tell us a little bit about our guest and what we hope to speak time talking about.
Sure, yeah. We're going to hear from Brian McMorris. He's the president of Futura Automation, which offers automation solutions to manufacturers and sort of helps them with the economics of bringing their operations back to the United States and balancing labor costs versus capital expenditure on robotics and things like that. Brian, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you fine. Thank you.
Well, Brian, welcome to the show. We, this is an opportunity to talk about what's happening around reindustrialization. Obviously, it's getting a lot of press. Tell us a little bit about the background of Futura.
Sure. Yeah, so I've been in the automation and robotics space for about, my whole career, since 1980. Started out in programmable logic controls. That was the technology of the day in 1980. Just got into it because I had a background in engineering and computers. So didn't really think about manufacturing back then, but I knew how I wanted to apply those skills. So got into that, graduated from college, and then went to work in the industry. I always had the idea I wanted to be in robotics. That was something I'm a Jetsons kid. I grew up with the Jetsons. So I had that in my mind, but there really wasn't much in the way of robotics back in the early 80s. But by the 90s, they became more prevalent. And I joined companies at that time, a couple of different companies that were focused on the robot industry. And because of my interest, I always put myself into that space and was working with companies that were applying robots. Then I'll just fast forward to 2016, I became the VP of Adept Robotics. It was one of the last American manufacturers of robots and had been struggling for 20 years or so, which is probably how I ended up there. So I spent about a year there, and then Omron, a Japanese company, acquired us, and I had to find something else to do. They didn't need a VP of sales since they had their own. So I I started my own company at that time, which was Futura Automation, with the goal of helping companies reshore. I'd always believed in that all the way back, into the 80s, when, of course, the Japanese invasion first kind of went after the robot industry and the car industry especially. But then, of course, China came along in the 1990s and 2000s. And so I saw manufacturing disappear before my eyes. I saw cities vaporized by the loss of their main industry. So I was very interested and motivated to help companies get back the manufacturing they had lost.
So, Brian, you've been doing this for a couple of years, back to really drive the reindustrialization story. Back in 2016, when Donald Trump was first elected and went into office in 2017, it was a pretty shocking turn of events where he was talking about putting pretty substantial tariffs on our number one trading partner at the time. But fast forward 7 years later, it seems like that message is really resonating with both corporations and businesses, but also consumers. What have you seen over the last couple of years that have really sort of changed the way people are thinking about this process?
Yeah, it's interesting that, of course, President Trump made an issue out of the Chinese trade practices, which weren't necessarily fair trade practices. A tariff-free world works great when everybody plays fairly and by the same rules. It doesn't work at all when some countries cheat and charge tariffs against your projects, or they might call it a value-added tax. That's another way of doing the same thing, is adding a tax. And it makes it an unfair playing ground, which already is unfair enough because of the differentials in labor cost. So we started to see 2 or 3 years ago, through various signaling into the government through the people, that we're kind of done with losing our manufacturing to foreign powers, specifically China. It's become a matter of national security, to be honest, in many different ways, not just defense, but also pharmaceuticals and food and automotive and down the line. We can't lose all of our manufacturing, or we have nothing. There's never been a country that has not manufactured anything. What would be the basis for the economy if that was the case? So there's been a lot of interest in bringing back the manufacturing that we had kind of stupidly given away over the last 20 or 30 years, I guess, trying to be nice guys or something like that, or being honest to the economist, Adam, I'll forget his last name now. But you know what I'm talking about. I mean, it's been dogma for 300, 400 years that free trade was the way to go. So it's kind of hard to break that through tariffs.
So a lot of people have pushed back. You mentioned, the Japanese were sort of in the 80s, the concern was that Japan was going to take over the world's economy. Right. Clearly, they stagnated in the 90s and have really, been, I wouldn't say irrelevant, but certainly the momentum has not favored the Japanese. China's a different story, largely due to its just massive amount of people and unlike the Japanese, the availability of resources that exist in China that just didn't exist in Japan. Why do you think this time is different in terms of the public opinion around China versus what we saw in the 80s with Japan?
I just think it's the scale of what's happened to manufacturing in America. The first go around in the 70s and 80s, manufacturing sort of needed a wake-up call. We all know the story, if we're old as I am. We know that the cars made in the 1970s weren't very good. The quality was poor. And when we started to see product come in from Japan that was lower cost and it was much higher quality, I think people thought, well, this is a good thing. This is showing our industry, one of our key industries, that things can be done better and differently. And that was fine because it hadn't really eroded in a big way the economy at that point in time, especially the economies of certain towns and cities. But along, came China, and as you say, for the exact reasons you gave, 3 times, 4 times our population, but also all the natural resources without the regulations. I mean, that's an important thing to remember, is they don't follow the same set of regulations we follow through the EPA and that sort of thing. So if they want to mine rare earths, they just go ahead and dig it up. And it's impossible to get a mine permitted in America. So that's something else we're going to have to address over the next several years, is changing the thought process around mining, because otherwise we're relying on other countries for all the most important minerals.
Brian, can you tell us a little bit about how Futura Automation helps companies reshore? And then I also want to hear, kind of what are you seeing from your customers? What do they care about? What kind of momentum exists today among the manufacturing community about bringing operations back to the United States?
Yeah, so practically speaking, I'll be honest, I mean, I don't get into the C-suite too often to have that conversation with my customers. I'm normally dealing with engineering level people at the factory floor, and I'm getting the output of their efforts over the last several years. They've planned and they've budgeted for projects, and when I see the project, it's already the commitment has been made to spend those dollars. But there has been, in just casual conversation, companies are bringing back their manufacturing. They see the need. For one thing, China's gotten a lot more expensive. So the labor costs there have gone up, just like they did in Japan, which is what kind of ended Japan's dominance. But there's also, of course, this tension between China and the United States. I think most people in management want to be good citizens. They want to do the right thing by their country. They don't want to be contributing to the downfall of American hegemony. So the money is being set aside. There's bumps in the road because of changes in our government, for example. Changes in interest rates have played a large role. The last few years, capital has gotten a lot tighter just because the interest rates have gone up. And there's been this general fear, I think, in the C-suite that we're going to hit a big recession. We haven't, but there was, because of the interest rates going up to 7%, and inflation at 9%, there was thoughts that we were going to have a big recession. It hasn't panned out, but that didn't stop the, C-suites from getting conservative about it.
How important is the cost of capital to your business and just the general sort of, prospect of, buying automation equipment to help onshore a factory?
Yeah, so that's a great question. There's two ends to my business. There's new projects and there's maintenance. So that's intentional. I don't want to get stuck in the capital equipment cycle. So when it comes to just maintaining equipment, maybe adding a piece of machinery to complement something that's already there, that's ongoing, and that's not really disturbed by interest rates or by the economy. But the new equipment business cycle is very strongly influenced by the cost of capital. So it was really cheap to get, of course, equipment many years ago now, 4 years ago, when interest rates were, at least the federal funds rate was, 0.1%. You could get loans as a business for 3 to 4%. Well, you can imagine that when you sell equipment to a company, and you folks probably know this, it's all about return on investment, right? ROI is the thing that drives it. So if you double the cost of capital or triple the cost of capital, it makes the ROI much more difficult. I mean, it makes it much more challenging for the management to justify. Maybe they want a 12-month ROI. That's pretty common in our business. But if it gets driven to 3 years by the cost of capital, then it's going to be much less practical, and not so much is going to happen.
So, Brian, let's talk a little bit about the conversation that seems to be really popping up a lot, is that the tariffs that Donald Trump has promoted, or at least has been reportedly has talked about, the conversation around inflation.
Can you talk a little bit about what your companies and your customers are saying about that particular part of the story?
Sure. Yeah, the tariff question, of course, is this goes back to the 30s and people's fear of tariffs, because in the 30s, the old beggar thy neighbor policy, but that was during a deep depression globally. And it truly was just one person taking from another, or one country taking from another. Most recently, tariffs have been much less impactful to the economy. I don't think we saw hardly any effect in that 2018-19 period, like you mentioned earlier. The tariffs did their job. I mean, some of the charts I sent you show the big change in direction between our production output prior to that period and after that period. So we've basically bottomed the loss of production in America, and it was largely due to that time, along with all of the talk about national security. So tariffs serve a purpose. Now, whether you can, some of the more bombastic stuff by President Trump is that, we can replace income taxes with tariffs.
This country can become rich with the proper use of tariffs.
Did you just float out the idea of getting rid of income taxes and replacing it with tariffs?
Well, okay.
Were you serious about that?
Yeah, sure. But why not?
I don't know about that. I mean, that was true in the 1890s, but in the 1890s, we didn't have the same government that we have today in terms of size and wastefulness, to be honest. It didn't do as much back then. There was no income tax, and the government costs were paid by tariffs. So some amount of, here's a way I always tell people to think of tariffs. All the other countries in the world, including Canada, including all the European countries, have a value-added tax. So anytime I sell product to Canada or even to Italy, for example, there's always a value-added tax applied to that product. That's a tariff. I mean, it's no different. It's a barrier to entry. They might have a program in their own country that gives a special benefit to the companies that they eliminate those value-added taxes for certain local production. I don't know all the ins and outs of that, but it's a tool that can be used to balance trade, value-added tax. It's just a nice way of saying tariff. Tariffs serve a purpose. The 200% tariff idea, I mean, some of that, like I say, is just bombastic. I mean, it's not really true. It makes a point. So, but 20, I think the discussion right now is a 10% kind of base tariff, kind of across the board, and then additional tariffs based upon how the countries trade with us, whether they trade fairly or not. So that seems to be a fair approach to me. I mean, if people are going to basically send, like steel dumping, classic steel dumping, if they're going to try and dump steel on our market to destroy our steel industry, I think there needs to be protection. And the steel industry was one of those industries protected in the 2018-19 period by Donald Trump.
Yeah, I think the discussion, at least been reported, is that Donald Trump plans on putting a 60% tariff on China specifically, and a 10%. The number has been bounced around by the media at 10 to 20%. It's hard to know what specific policy, but at least a blanket tariff, and then an accelerated tariff or a much more punitive tariff on China. One of the things that is commonly not talked about, because the economists and the academics like to talk about potential inflation, but one of the things that you mentioned, Brian, and I think is an important point, is the national security element, which is really probably the most important message of all, is without a manufacturing base in the United States, is that we are dependent upon countries which are run by governments and leaders that are hostile to our national interests and our national security. Talk a little bit about what is driving companies to think about it from a national security standpoint.
Yeah, so in national security, again, I don't normally have that conversation directly with customers. It might come up sort of as an aside or something. But the idea that you can have a defense, you can have a military, without steel. You can't have a military without steel. You have to build ships with something. You have to build aircraft with something. It might be aluminum in that case, but you have to build aircraft, titanium. I work with a company in Las Vegas. It's actually, I think, headquartered in Pennsylvania, but it's Titanium Metals Corp, a Berkshire Hathaway subsidiary. And they're a strategic industry. You can't do aircraft and aerospace in this world that we're in without having titanium. So they are a precious, there's only a couple of titanium companies in the country, and they're one of them. I think there's two. So you've got to protect something like Titanium Metals, TIMET for short. But when I talk with them, we're doing some upgrades with them, some automation upgrades with them, but this topic never really comes up. I mean, this is something, again, it's a C-suite kind of a thing that doesn't get down to the people that I'm talking to. They all have their opinion, but we don't share it. So how important is national security as an objective to somebody like Titanium Metals? I think it's probably very important. I think most of what they do goes to the aircraft industry. Boeing is one of their biggest customers. It gets processed first. The titanium goes through another Berkshire Hathaway company called Precision Cast Parts.
Yes.
So this is typical. The automotive industry, because I'm in Arizona, I work a lot with aerospace, but automotive, is Great Lakes industry primarily. And automotive is, we have to remember that when World War II came along, that it was Ford and General Motors and whatnot that were asked to build the tanks, build the armaments. If you don't have an automotive industry, a very hefty automotive industry that's connected to all of its supply chain already with all the steel inputs and all the first and second tier manufacturers that supply all the parts, if that's not all in place, you cannot have the ability to respond to a large war. So fortunately, in the 30s, we had that in place. It wasn't, of course, up to the scale of World War II, but it was in place. So it was possible to crank it up. If you had to start from scratch, you wouldn't have time. I mean, it would be over. So it's important to have a manufacturing base so you can protect yourself for the purpose of sovereignty.
Yeah, that's a great point. In World War II, the United States produced about 500,000 airplanes during that 4-year period. I mean, that's 100,000 airplanes a year were being produced by the United States. Put that in perspective. We produce about 6,000 airplanes total a year in the United States. So the level of manufacturing, and Ford, the auto manufacturers were in many ways, and you can see this in every country around the world, the auto manufacturers were also the manufacturers of aircraft, which were instruments of war.
The B-24 Liberator was built in Willow Run in Michigan at an auto plant. Fun fact, the B-29 program, which is the strategic bomber we used in the Pacific War, that whole thing cost more than the Manhattan Project.
Amazing. But I think Brian's point of manufacturing, having a manufacturing base, it's the skill set to do precision metal, it's the equipment, it's the supply chain, all of that matters if you're going to fight a potential conflict with an adversary like China. We've lived in this real peaceful time. Brian, when we think about sort of what does it take, there's been a lot of conversation about bringing manufacturing back. And one of the counter arguments is that, well, these jobs are not coming back. The jobs we lost in the 80s and the 90s and over the last 10, 15, 20 years are not coming back. And I think that's fair. I mean, textile manufacturing, garment manufacturing, the things that kept a lot of these southern cities afloat probably isn't coming back. I think that's fair to say, or at least the jobs as is. What is coming back to the United States? Where are you seeing the momentum? How are companies thinking about automating their factories? What does this look like 10 years from now in terms of automation and factories here in the U.S.?
Yeah, and the reason you hit on it exactly, the reason why the jobs don't have to come back, we don't have to have the manpower to re-employ like we did in the 70s and 80s, is because of automation and robotics. The industries that are most interested or willing to open the checkbook for robotics today, automotive has always been, since the beginning of robots, the main industry that was sort of promoting or progressing the robotics industry. But more recently, in the last 15 years or so since I've really been intensely involved with this. It's been the medical device industry. So medical devices, personal devices like diabetes control or something like that, insulin pumps or whatever it might be, dialysis machines. Those are mass manufactured in the millions, and that robotics really lends itself to that kind of mass manufacturing. Today, robots are stupid enough. They take so much training and they take so much tooling to do something useful that you can't make a robot work for a production run of 10 parts or 100 parts. It has to be something substantial, over 1,000 a year, something like that at the minimum. So you have to look at the consumer industries or the commercial industries where the volumes are relatively high. And that would be medical device, that would be aerospace. We do a lot of work in aerospace, not that thousands and tens of thousands of planes are made, but there's a lot of repetitive parts in planes that are made by robot. So it's might be getting into the defense industries. I don't get to hear. I work with a couple of defense companies, but they don't tell me what they're doing with the robotics that we're supplying to them. So for
probably better you don't know. You might become a
exactly. I don't want to know that sort of.
If they told you, they'd have to kill you, kind of thing. Brian, one of the things that strikes me is that you talked about high volume being a key characteristic. But also, airplanes, like we've talked about, aren't typically high volume, but they're big ticket. Do you think that's really sort of the trade-off that we're going to see? Is either big ticket items that require lots of sort of complications, and airplane is a perfect example of that. Automotive manufacturing and high big volume consumer goods. Is that where we should expect to see? What industries are actually is the United States poorly positioned in terms of bringing manufacturing back, or would we even want to bring manufacturing back, or not?
Yeah, so there's some novel application. I gave you the key applications. Packaging is the other one for food and beverage and whatnot. That's highly automated, robotics everywhere in food manufacturing because again, volumes are high, consumer goods. But the interesting thing about food products is, and this is maybe to help make this point, they're low value. And there's definitely a trade-off between low and high value and the volume. So the lower the volume, the more volume you need. The higher the value, the less volume you need. It's hard. It's a subjective decision. So you can't make a mathematical equation on that. But it trends that way. So food. All the actual processing and manufacturing of food is done by what I would call hard automation. It's done by old-time processes, vats, and colanders and kinds of tools you find in a kitchen, but they're industrial scale and there's conveyors and that sort of thing. But when it comes to packaging the food, that's when you start to see the robots being applied, and especially when the packaging is put into a case, case packing generically, the case taping, and then putting the case on a pallet. All of that is very automated. Something like clothes, you mentioned, clothing before. That's one of the hardest industries for a robot. The volumes may be high, but the sizes are all over the map. The colors and all the types of fabrics that are used, it's all over the map. So the unit volume might be low, even if the overall volume might be high. And then the other problem with fabric is it's just flimsy. So robots, again, the tooling is not great on robots. They're not nearly as dexterous as a human hand, but they can't. It's hard to pick the fabric and stretch it out, and like you would for packaging it or something like that. So those are all challenges that people are working on, but it probably is quite a few years off because the value is relatively low. It's very hard to work with. It requires a lot of specialized tooling that doesn't exist yet. So clothing is probably the one that's most difficult for robots, to be honest, and from a cost standpoint. And then something that is like you say, high value precision, like medical device, is going to be, you don't have to do that many medical devices to justify a robot. So we did very well in my business in 2020 and 2021 during COVID because everybody was in a rush to develop testing kits and the injectors and whatnot for the vaccine. All of that was rush. There was money being thrown at it by the government, so it didn't take high volumes to justify, doing robotics and people couldn't go to work, so there really was nothing left but robots to do the manufacturing.
So, Brian, is it safe to say that the sewing, these factories you see on TV, or perhaps if you've gone to Asia, these factories of largely women, at least the ones that I've seen, women that are sewing clothing is going to continue to be a part of our trade, but when it comes to higher value components, and it seems like if we're making the argument on national security alone, it seems like you want certain items that actually drive national security. Clothing isn't one.
T-shirts not so important.
Yeah, T-shirts don't really matter, right?
That's true, and so the interesting thing there is China's actually kind of out of the fabric, the clothing business. That's all moved to Bangladesh and Vietnam and places like that with lower cost labor. So if it's just pure manual labor, then a country quickly evolves out of the realm of making clothing, because it is such a labor intensive kind of a business. And like I say, that's the last frontier, I think, for robotics. There's so many other things that we can do earlier on, especially that are critical to national security. We didn't talk about chemical processes because they don't have much robotics. They're process automation, but bringing the chemical industry that for the precursors to all of our pharmaceuticals back to the U.S. is another critical task, because we've let all that go. And if we get shut off by China on all of the pharmaceuticals that we need, then that's going to be a bad scenario.
So, Brian, I'm going to make you the national trade advisor for the White House. For the next few minutes, I want you to talk about this. In terms of priority, both economic, national security, and ease of use, perhaps robotic automation is there. Which industries are you prioritizing to say that these are the most important industries to bring back to domestic onshoring, and frankly are the ones that we can, whether it's robotics or other forms of implementation, that we can win at? Which ones would you prioritize?
So we've mentioned several of them already. I would focus on pharmaceutical manufacturing. And that's, again, more hard automation than robotics. I would focus on medical device. We have an aging population. People want to stay healthy. Automotive for sure. Aerospace for sure. And when I say automotive, I mean anything that moves on wheels. I mean trains and trucks and buses and the whole 9 yards I lump that into automotive, as including ag equipment. So don't ever want to let John Deere and Caterpillar are already very committed to robotics. I can tell you that from experience. So we haven't lost that, but we don't want to lose it because it's critical so that we can grow our food. Military, of course, like I say, is sort of an adjunct, or it adds on to aerospace and automotive. Armaments, the munitions is another aspect, but again, the munitions companies usually are now part of that big 10 or so defense contractors that are already in place. So we can't, and munitions are really good for robots because they're dangerous to manufacture, the handling of them and that type of thing. So, those are the kind of the key industries that we already work with. Food and beverage, I mentioned, we want to maintain our food supply. And, if I was also advising, I'd probably start looking at trying to limit the amount of farmland that we sell to China. I mean, if anything, we might even want to try and claw some of that back in some cases. So it is, we can't give up our farmland. I mean, that's just crazy. So
Brian,
it has been going on.
One of the industries you did mention is consumer electronics. And on Foxconn's last earnings call, their CEO noted the changing of the guard in the White House, the imminent administration coming in, and said that they're prepared to rapidly onshore more production back into the U.S., that they already have operations in, I think, Wisconsin and Texas and Ohio, but they're ready to bring on more. Do you guys work with electronics companies? What's the kind of state of play there?
I guess I haven't talked about that because it's been so long since we've done much consumer electronics in this country. I kind of forget about it. When I first got into the business in the 80s and 90s, we were doing a lot of printed circuit board work, and a lot of the circuit boards were populated. They were stuffed by hand. Now there's machines that have been developed at any kind of volume. The boards get stuffed and soldered and everything by machine. So that's been around for a long time. We just let it go. We didn't have to let it go, but I would definitely want to bring that back. I mean, I just didn't mention it. And robotics are heavily used in electronic assembly already. I mean, that's an industry that was roboticized, 15, 20 years ago. And it's just done nothing but increase. And even in China, they use robots primarily now for electronic board manufacturing. So, Foxconn has been, of course, Foxconn is a Taiwanese-owned country, so whether that becomes mainland China or not, we'll see. But, Foxconn has been heavily invested in the U.S. in that direction. They haven't really produced any of these big plants that they've talked about with massive output. There's been plans like the Wisconsin plan a few years ago that never really took off. But they would be a player. But we also have other, contract, CMs, contract manufacturers in the U.S. that are still here. Benchmark is based here in Phoenix now. There is Plexus. There's probably 5 or 6 Flextronics, or just Flex as it goes by today. So those companies still exist in the U.S., but they've scattered their manufacturing all over the world. They probably need to be encouraged to bring manufacturing back to the U.S. I mean, that would be, as the czar of trade, I guess that's something I would really push hard on, and including getting Foxconn to do what it said it's going to do.
So Brian, your expectation in terms of the tariffs, if we do see even the most aggressive, the levels of those tariffs, your expectation as it relates to inflation or sort of economic impacts, how should we expect that 5 years? What's the report card you would give if we were to see the most aggressive tariffs in place?
Well, yeah, most aggressive practical tariffs that make sense, economic sense. I think actually we can probably displace quite a bit of tax. Maybe we won't lower the income tax, but we won't have to raise it. That's probably a good goal. If we can leave the income tax around the average of 20% or whatever it's at today, it's been there for, if you look, 30 years, 40 years, it's been there a long time. So we're all comfortable with that. So help with the deficit through the tariffs, I think. And then the tariffs will also then encourage manufacturing, encourage business growth in the U.S., and business growth, is going to generate more taxes from that business growth. So I think that's a good way to stop the bleeding, and then maybe some of the healing. So I don't know if we get all the way there with a decent tariff program, but I am not anti-tariff anymore. I probably was at one time because of all my reading, when I was younger, about the beggar thy neighbor policies in the 30s. But I think it serves its purpose if it's managed and not used punitively against the other countries.
And what has you most excited for the next 5 years in terms of Futura Automation's prospects for growth and the kind of bullish trends for your own business?
Yeah, so my company is half consulting and half product sales. As a rep, I'm a rep primarily. I don't manufacture anything myself, so I can see the opportunity to do more, greenfield type projects where there's going to be just a new plant built to manufacture product in America, bring some of that manufacturing home. I think we'll see a lot more of that. I think a lot of those companies might come from Taiwan. I've already seen a couple of Southwest companies right here in Phoenix. Of course, we have Taiwan Semiconductor and their huge plant that they're building on the north side of the city. And that's Taiwan Semiconductor's efforts to diversify away from just having everything in Taiwan, which is very smart. Of course, we already have Intel here, and that Intel plant is doubling in size. So we can see more and more of that, and a lot of that is fresh plant from the ground up, new equipment, and it puts a lot of demand on all of the supply chain. And I'm part of that supply chain. That's my role, is to supply equipment and hardware, robots to manufacturing sites. So the more demand that there is, the better it will be for me. I don't have any specific goals or expectations, but it'll be good.
Brian, what is the sort of, to wrap up the conversation, what should manufacturers know about what it takes to successfully, if they're thinking about reshoring or reindustrialization in the U.S., what is the playbook to be successful at that?
Yeah, I think that if I'm them, I first study what the competitors are doing, or not in America necessarily, but anywhere in the world. Automation is sort of a playing field leveler, right? I mean, the differentials in labor and that sort of thing are less important when you have a robot, because robots cost the same thing everywhere. Several of the robot companies they're either in Japan, like Fanuc and Kawasaki and Mitsubishi, or they're in China now. KUKA, one of the big companies that used to be a German company, is now owned by the Chinese, and they have manufacturing there. Adept is now made in Japan when it was purchased by Omron. So a lot of the robots are made in those countries already. It would be nice to see some of that robot manufacturing come back to the U.S. I don't have any near-term expectation of that because there's no companies here anymore. But that would be an important thing. And we also have to bring back, like I said, mining of rare earth metals, because robots, as an example, use servo motors that have rare earth magnets to be compact and high power. And all that rare earth material, the minerals, are all controlled by China today. So we need to bring that back to the U.S. so we can build our own servo motors, which are used in everything. They're used in tanks and aircraft, and aircraft is all fly by wire now. They use servos to control the aircraft. They use it to control the missiles. All that is controlled by China. We've given all of it up. And the people that are anti-mining, I know that they are well-intentioned, but they don't understand what they're doing to this country and the danger they're putting us all in. So we need to start mining again, but in a way that is environmentally conscientious.
So mining is one. Obviously, energy. If I'm thinking about a factory, I got to think about energy supply. Is that a big consideration among companies thinking about electricity, power, industrial level energy? Is that something that is top of mind?
Not really. The industrial plants usually have an adequate supply. They don't use that much power compared to these data farms, these server farms, I guess, are just chewing up all kinds of power. But in the macro sense, eventually, if those data farms and EVs, for example, all the charging stations, if they start to consume more and more of the available power on the grid, then something's going to have to be done to complement that power. And nuclear is the obvious solution. I mean, I'm a very pro-nuclear guy. That was my first engineering studies in college, was nuclear engineering back in the 70s. So there is a new company or two out there that are looking at small modular reactors. They're modular. They start at like 70 megawatts, and you just put a bunch of them together to get to a gigawatt or whatever you need. A typical coal-fired plant's probably a gigawatt. So you put 10 of them or 12 of them together and you get a gigawatt. But that's a trend. They're much less expensive. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission is just now giving them their approvals. So that technology is right around the corner. Companies can start probably buying those now, putting their money down, and solve the energy problem in this country.
And then labor obviously is a big consideration, because even if you've got an automated factory with robotics, you still have humans that have to be a part of it.
Absolutely.
Is that part of the sort of calculus for companies?
It is. And that has been somewhat addressed, not in the scale that's necessary, but there's a lot of effort to transfer robotic knowledge, automation knowledge through the community college or VOTEC college programs. So a lot more community colleges now offer a robotics certificate, 2-year degree, than that used to be the case even 10 years ago. And that's what needs to happen across the country. Is there needs to be partnerships between industry that needs these employees and the local community colleges that need the funding to help develop the labs and whatnot, because you have to buy robots and other equipment to give the kids something to work on. The students are there. I mean, we've had a lot of, you probably know, the robot, I'll drop the name in my mind now, but there's contests, there's competitions in the high schools now between various kids, various schools in building their own robots. The BattleBot kind of thing was big a few years ago. There's been soccer bots, you make robots to do soccer. So that kind of engagement with teens and even preteens makes it so that these kids, when they get to college, they want to study industrial robots and they want to have a career in the field. So that's already kind of in place. It might need to have a little encouragement, from the government, but especially from industry. So if the manufacturers themselves could sponsor these colleges, like Lucid here in Arizona, has worked with the Coolidge Votech in the Casa Grande area. And that Votech didn't have a robot program 5 or 6 years ago, but when Lucid decided to come in here, they helped establish that program. And that's what needs to happen.
Well, Brian, it's been an amazing conversation, and we'd love to continue to follow your journey, but also the journey of America's reindustrialization. We hope to have you back. Really, a lot to think about here, JP.
Yeah, it was super interesting. I love just hearing about the kind of the decision-making calculus of these companies, and whether it's the cost of capital, whether it's the labor supply, whether it's access to the materials they need, what all goes into these like reshoring decisions.
So Brian, before we go, just one last question for you. Do you think this is something that is really going to accelerate over the next couple of years? Are we going to see a real push for reindustrialization? Is this more than just news? It's actually happening?
Yeah. No, I without getting political, I think the person that was elected to the president is going to accelerate this direction. It was something that a lot of industry wanted anyway. They wanted this direction from our government. Not that the other, the Biden, administration was considering all of this. It was something that they were concerned about as well. Biden never dropped those tariffs on China, but they wouldn't have been as aggressive as the Trump administration will be in making this happen. Because if you've seen who Trump's putting into his cabinet, it's a lot of people from the business sector that, Elon Musk is his personal advisor at this point. And we all know what Elon Musk has been able to do over the last 15 or 20 years. I've had experience with SpaceX too, and they've applied automation and robotics, but he's huge on, if you know Tesla, I mean, Elon Musk really focused on putting robots in Tesla and eliminating as much labor as he could. So with that as Trump's advisor, and Vivek as well, Ramaswamy, along with others, I just listened to Joe Lonsdale on the news network this morning, and Lonsdale is one of the founders of Palantir. Peter Thiel, of course, was an eBay guy with Elon Musk. So there's a whole bunch of new entrepreneurs that are very interested in helping Trump drive this whole thing.
Yeah, Joe Lonsdale is a FreightWaves investor. He was one of our.
Oh, great! Didn't know that.
He's actually our largest, or APC is our largest investor on the cap table. So we're certainly fans. Lots going on. We hope to have you back, Brian. Thanks so much for your time.
Yeah. Thank you very much. We'll see you guys soon.
Well, it was a fantastic conversation, JP. A really exciting time in industrialization. I love talking to people that are on the ground of what's happening.
Yeah, it's cool. It's not, it's not necessarily like a startup or like a brand new idea, but someone who's, business day in, day out for decades has been equipping factories with what they need to succeed here in the United States.
Well, Brian makes the case for industrialization, both on a national security standpoint as well as an economic one. But he also has seen stuff firsthand on what industries work really well. Really, I think, interesting conversation about what types of industries we should be prioritizing, both from the ease of robotics automation, but also from just the
ROI
and the national security element. I think gives us a lot to consider. So a fantastic conversation, and always we have great guests. Thank you for recruiting Brian and bringing him into the show. And really, we're going to continue to follow this American reindustrialization story. It's so important to bring it home. You can support us by subscribing to the Bring It Home newsletter, which is a new feature as part of this package. You can go to bringithome.us to subscribe. Please follow the shows. Support our guests. Network about the conversation happening in reindustrialization. We're going to continue to follow the story and all of the elements. And if you've missed any of the shows, we've covered some fantastic episodes that have covered all elements of the American reindustrialization story and how we bring manufacturing home. We've covered energy. We've covered aerospace. We've covered just a whole array. This is all about robotics automation, but really just bringing all of it. We even covered, Memphis and its play and sort of the playbook for the American reindustrialization story. So yet again, another exciting episode of Bring It Home, where we explore the American reindustrialization renaissance.